Hello and welcome to another episode of GreenZone, videocast series provided by FES in the run-up of COP27 in Sharm El Sheikh. We have the chance today to talk to Robert Muthami, who is following international climate discussions for a very long time already. He is with the FES office in Nairobi, and we are happy to talk to him today. Well, we are in 2022. We had, let's say, a COP26 that was not so much of a success. How do you evaluate what happened in the aftermath of COP26 so far?
I would say that COP26, of course, had its own challenges. And from COP26, we've seen various engagements at the international level, feeding into the upcoming COP27. At the African level, there has been various engagements, including the African Ministerial Conference on Environment. There has been the Africa Climate Week. There has also been the Africa Pre-COP that was recently held in DRC Congo. These key organizations or convenings are very important, especially in consolidating the Africa's voice towards COP27.
Do you have the impression so far that the African voice is sufficiently united?
I would say from the various engagements with the African group of negotiators, and I think this also resonates with the key demands from the African group, the civil society, and even the trade union actors. I would say that from a climate justice perspective, it's very clear and within the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that Africa will be impacted more than another region, and the adverse impacts of climate change are limiting the Africa's economic development trajectory. On the top priorities and where we see a lot of convergence between African governments, civil society, and trade unions is the aspect of the recognition of the Africa's special needs and circumstances at COP27. The African group of negotiators has submitted as requested that COP27 considers the African needs and circumstances so that at least we have a leeway or a pathway to keep on demanding on the means of implementation that are required for African countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And in this case, many of the African civil society, trade unions actors, and also the many African governments, they demand that COP27 should adopt decisions that recognize the African needs and circumstances, and also ensuring that there are practical, tangible programs for implementation of climate actions in Africa. And I think there is that sense of speaking with one voice and the consistent engagements between the AGN, the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, and the CAOSOC, that is the Conference of African Heads of States on Climate Change, which is currently chaired by Kenya. And therefore, we see COP27 as an implementation COP, a COP that is held in Africa.
This is not the first African COP. I mean, there had been a couple of meetings already, 4, if I'm not mistaken, South Africa, Nairobi, and 2 in Marrakesh. So far, African delegations every time left the venue a little disappointed, if I guess. Am I wrong?
Yes, you are right. You are right, and it's because that COP is a party-driven process, and I think it being a party-driven process, I think every party has an equal opportunity, basically to continue championing for their specific aspects and what they are demanding for from their own specific countries, because every country has submitted its national determined contribution, which is very clear on their mitigation potential, what they require to enhance their climate actions and the ambition that they have. Africa countries are paying up to 10% of their GDP for climate change adaptation actions, and therefore, with climate finance not flowing, then we have a challenge in terms of how the continent responds to the African needs and vulnerabilities. I think from my own perspective, I think the African governments should present like the cost of adaptation and the cost of loss or damage from the African continent, so that it provides a case that could rally the global community to even have a keen interest on the key demands that African countries are having, especially on the needs on adaptation, the needs on responding to the loss and damage challenges, and even the recognition of the African special needs and circumstances.
What is a bargain chip actually the African countries have when it comes to the complex negotiations with the industrialized North? I mean, apart from asking gently to reduce the emissions, what is actually there?
Basically, the African countries have three broad priorities and the key asks in this upcoming COP. And one of the key demands in the upcoming COP27 for African countries is a priority on the multilateral efforts on adaptation, and also ensuring that we provide the loss and damage support that is required and the recognition of the African special needs and circumstances. And COP27 being in Africa, it presents that opportunity to advance the African needs and priorities. And like I've mentioned, it's important that that we secure the maximum ambition in terms of climate action. And it's an opportune moment for developed countries to honor their commitments and the provision of the enabling means of implementation and support for developing countries. And basically, the three broad issues, the adaptation financing, the loss and damage support. And when you talk about the loss and damage support, we're talking about a loss and damage financing facility that is separate from the existing mitigation and adaptation financing facility, and basically the overall recognition of the African special needs and circumstances for Africa. Those are the three overarching demands that Africa wants delivered in the upcoming COP27 that will be held in Egypt. But in a nutshell, I think this will not be achieved if African civil society, trade unions, and even the African governments will not speak in one voice. The element of alliance building is quite important within the African groups as we build momentum towards COP27.
Wouldn't you say that the focus on the $100 billion pledge is too much focus on money? Actually, even there, if there is a gap of a couple of billion here or there, it doesn't matter as long as the emissions produced by the North will continue as is.
Yes, that's very right. And I think the challenge that we have at the moment with the reduction of the emissions trajectory for both the developing and the developed countries, and of course the developed countries have the huge responsibility in the limiting of greenhouse gas emissions, is that the responsive nature in terms of cutting down their emissions from their economics that are highly dependent on fossil fuels is of much importance. And the challenge that we have at the moment is the lack of clarity in terms of how developed countries are progressing in the implementation of their own nationally determined contributions. I think we really need to take stock as quickly as possible, especially in terms of the pathways that developed countries are taking in cutting down emissions based on what they have promised within their nationally determined contributions. Because, like you're saying, I agree with you completely that if we continue, yes, and climate finance is of utmost importance in this COP, but if we do not commit into cutting down our emissions based on our commitments in our NDCs, then I think we will not be moving. But I think the climate financing aspect is of utmost importance for African countries, because at the moment, many of the African communities facing the climate crisis, the food insecurity in the African countries is actually rising. If you look at what is happening in the Horn of Africa at the moment, and looking at the increasing food security dynamics, it has actually a huge implication on how people access food, how people access clean water, how people even access clean and affordable energy, and even affordable food prices within the Horn of Africa. And droughts, floods are increasingly being seen in most of the African countries. And if the climate finance is not flowing for adaptation efforts, especially for developing countries like in Africa, then we're putting many lives in danger. There must be commitment in terms of addressing limiting of the greenhouse gas emissions, moving from technologies that are dirty, moving from dirty energy to clean energy. But as we do all this, there is the aspect of moving very fast. That is around limiting the greenhouse gas emissions. But our demand from the civil society and even from the trade unions aspect is the aspect of moving just, moving people, putting people at the center of the low carbon development pathway, ensuring that we protect the jobs of the people employed in in those particular sectors that we are moving from, ensuring that we take into consideration when we employing technologies, for example, the renewable energy technologies, that we reskill people from the traditional technologies or from the traditional sectors to the new sectors, in ensuring that we protect those jobs. We ensure that, for example, in the energy sector, we have affordable energy and clean energy that is accessible to all and even the vulnerable within the community. So the justice element in this particular transition is quite important. Of course, yes, we want to move very fast, but let us put the justice element in this particular transition.
Based on your experience and expertise, Robert, if we speak in 6 weeks from now at the end of November, what will the most likely or probable outcome of COP27 be?
COP27 is scheduled at a time when the Paris Agreement is being implemented and the international community is struggling to recover from the socioeconomic crisis generated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And with this, the reduced resources available in many countries for climate actions. But also this challenge is also increased by the Russia-Ukraine war that has basically fueled the geopolitical tensions, disrupted also the supply, the global supply chains, generated also crisis in terms of energy and food prices. And basically from a social justice perspective, many countries within the African continent are actually facing the impact of the COVID-19 and even the increasing food prices just because of the Ukraine-Russian war. For it to be successful, then it must deliver basically the overarching issues, and one of them is actually the loss and damage, the loss and damage financing facility, which we look at it as should be a separate financing mechanism from the already financing mechanisms that exist for adaptation and mitigation. And I think when the adaptation and financing mechanisms were created, there was an oversight in terms of the impact that loss and damage would have in the African continent. I think it will be important to have an outcome that delivers a mechanism for addressing loss and damage that is separate from the existing financing mechanisms that are currently financing adaptation and mitigation on the climate change aspect. But having the COP27 in Egypt, I think, and having a COP in Africa basically provides a mechanism and a space to even have the voice of the African different groups, that is the civil society, trade unions, actors, and even governments, to even to be heard more based on the cases that they present on the climate change vulnerabilities from the African continent. So, of course, it doesn't mean that the tactics will change in negotiations. The same tactics will be there, but it's an opportunity for African countries to showcase what they demand for, to showcase what they are putting in place, even within their governments, in terms of climate change adaptation from the respective African countries. And I think we might have an outcome that, of course, will continue the momentum, especially on the discussions around the financing for loss and damage, I see COP27 as an opportunity where countries or parties can agree on a roadmap for delivering a climate finance facility. I don't see an outcome around loss and damage that will basically like agree on this is how we are going to approach the loss and the loss and damage financing facility. But I see an opportunity where I see an outcome that basically will agree on working further on loss and damage, working further on loss and damage financing facility. But the problem will be on the how, and this would be a big frustration for most of the African countries. I think the other discussion that would be advanced, and I see an outcome relating to enhanced efforts for financing adaptation efforts. I think the demand for the new and additional financing on the adaptation is a key demand for African countries. There might be discussions that will, of course, progress that discussion on the global goal and adaptation in trying to further how it should look like. But I think we might not get like what we're demanding for, especially on the contributions for financing adaptation. But there might be progression and key demands to work on the issue, to continue providing more resources for adaptation for African countries. The other thing that Africa is demanding for, the African special needs and circumstances, I think is an agenda that is in here and there. It's 50-50 that it will be considered. But of course, I think we have an opportunity where this particular African needs and circumstances should be considered. But if that doesn't happen, and in the unlikely event that it doesn't happen, then I think the demands for the means of implementation from the African continent are very clear, and that should be respected. And even within the precedents of the convention and within the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that's within the convention. That's what I see as the broad outlook of how the delivery for the COP27 should look like. I don't see a lot of celebrations after COP27 because the geopolitical issues are also still there. The Russia-Ukraine war is still there. The impacts of COVID-19 and especially the economic crisis that is exacerbated by those issues is still there. And I think we really need to rethink on the climate ambition, because I honestly think that the Russia-Ukraine war, the developed countries have actually put a lot of interest into it. And climate crisis has been with us for quite some time. If developed countries could actually put the same seriousness that they are put in the response to the Ukraine-Russian war to providing the required means of implementation for addressing the climate crisis, then I think we should be at an advanced stage. So in this case, I think the developed countries should actually be very serious, especially in putting the climate crisis, especially in as a key priority. Also, more than even how they have put the Ukraine-Russian war as a priority. And I think that is quite important. And even from the African civil society perspective and the demands from the trade unions, I think it's a key demand that what we're seeing the developed countries having an interest and putting a lot of priority in the Ukraine-Russian war. The climate crisis is more than that. And I think they should put a lot of priority into this in delivering a financing mechanism or the means of implementation in averting the climate crisis that is hardly or much affecting most of the African countries.
One can only hope. Thank you very much, Robert. We have to come to an end, unfortunately, but I can promise you this is obviously not the last time that we will be speaking. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks a lot, Konstantin, and thanks for inviting me, and looking forward to further engagement on the climate justice discourse in Africa.